And go. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the reception tonight at the Prairie Renaissance Cultural Alliance in Morris, Minnesota. We have Jenny Nellis here with us tonight, and she is exhibiting her work. And the exhibit is called Observing Nature. And you will see lots of sculpture and collage. And these are inspired by nature. Jenny is a great observer of nature and also a bookmaker, a sculptor, and she puts things in curious arrangements to pique your interest and to get you inspired about nature. Jenny was a professor at the University of Minnesota Morris for over 30 years, and we are happy to have her with us tonight. Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you, Lauren. I guess that I'll go around and sort of talk about some of the pieces here that what inspired me about them. Obviously, nature is the thing that I'm interested in. And I enjoy looking at things when I'm gardening. You know, you all, I think I look out at this audience that's here and many of you garden, I know. And, you know, when you're out there digging in the dirt, you find stuff or going through your compost pile. I mean, you never know what little treasures you're going to find. And a lot of the things in this piece, which I call Wunderkammer or Cabinet of Curiosity. And I was inspired by the cabinets of curiosities that historically people kept, where they collected things and then kept them in a room or kept them in display cases, things that were unusual, curious, rare. And that's basically what I'm trying to do with this piece, where I'm finding things around my yard and garden, sometimes in the garden, sometimes in my shrubs, and I like categorizing them. Even as a child, I liked going to museums, and museums are a place where I feel really comfortable, Natural History Museum. And that's basically what sort of makes me interested in kind of lining things up and preparing them to be looked at or viewed, inspected closely. And that's what I was trying to do with this piece. I think it does it pretty well. Some of the things are from far-flung places, but a lot of it comes right out of the yard around my house. And the book that I made here called Familiar Trees also comes from trees that grow in my yard or grow in places in the Midwest where I visited. Again, I'm interested in looking at nature, the leaves, the animals that live in the trees, the twigs, the buds, which we all hope we'll see someday soon. And I'm interested in wood in particular. I like carving wood, and the piece on the floor is based on a slippery elm seed, which again, I found way too many of in my flower garden, which like to sprout. And they're a little different from the American elm seed or some of the other elm seeds. And you really have to look at them to notice those differences. And so I got really interested in the slippery elm seeds and carved this piece out of basswood, which looks sort of like a slippery elm seed, a little bit hybridized. And the ceramic pieces here, some of which were fired in Richard Bresnahan's kiln, and some of which were fired in the wood kiln, are also loosely based on seeds that I see in the garden. Weed seeds are particularly interesting. And that the difference in the colors and the textures really comes from the difference in the way the two kilns are fired. The piece that's back here is based on the seed pod of a blackberry lily. And it was fired in the UMM kiln also. Some of you I know are interested in ceramics and have purchased things from the students and are familiar with the fact that UMM has a wood kiln and fires it once or so times a year. The pieces on the wall, the collages, are very obviously done in the winter when there's nothing else to do outside. So things that were gathered throughout the year and then sitting around in my studio with the wood stove going and looking at things and sort of gluing them together. And they're really based on spending a lot of time out in nature. My toolbox is, again, shapes that were inspired by nature and is kind of a categorization sort of thing, kind of like what I was talking about with the Cabinet of Curiosity, liking to arrange things in order. Part of the pieces are cast in bronze and part of them are cast in iron. And then I made this little wood box for them to exist in. So if anyone has any particular questions they'd like to ask me, I'd be happy to try to expound on things.
Is this slippery the same as a Siberian?
I don't know.
Which is what it's supposed to be like.
I think the slippery elm is not the same as the Siberian from the little bit of tree research that I did. I had a hard time first identifying the seed that I was carrying around, trying to figure out what it was from, because it kind of looked like an elm seed, the American elm seed, but not really. The edges of it are much thinner and finer than the American elm seed. I'm not sure what the Siberian elm looks like.
Looks like a weed to me.
So that seed at the top where the wings are overlapping, is that how it was, or it wasn't broken? That's how it grows.
That's how it grows.
No, then it's definitely different.
Yeah, the American elm seed is more oval in shape and is kind of hairy. And it has 2 points, but they don't cross over each other the way that seed does. I was attracted to the fact that those parts kind of cross over each other. And of course, it turned out to be really difficult during the carving process. You know, you don't think about those things so much when you're getting ideas and you're like thinking about what this could look like if instead of being this big, it were this big. And I really like the textures from the gouge marks in the wood. That's something I really enjoy. I enjoy the hand carving process. And then you get to parts of it and you're going, oh, I didn't know this was going to be this challenging. And, you know, then you spend a lot of time kind of trying to work out how to do what you're doing. And I do all my carving by hand. I don't use power tools for carving. So I do the traditional mallet and gouges.
How long did that take to make?
I can't carve for too long at a time. So I worked on it a lot during the first year of COVID. Because of course I wasn't going out so much. So I spent a lot of time carving, but I can carve for like 3-4 hours at a stretch. And you know, that's about it. Right now I'm working on Siberian iris bud, which is interesting. It's about 4 feet long and about 12, 14 inches wide. And, you know, it's just carving when you're doing it all by hand can be kind of strenuous, so.
I didn't look carefully at the elm, but is it one piece of wood?
It is not one piece of wood. It was a group of pieces of wood that were glued up, because you can't really find pieces of wood that are that big. So it's a series of pieces that were glued up. And then set about carving. And then surfaces. Surfaces are another thing to think about. I know that when some people have looked at it, they didn't believe it was wood, but it is in fact wood. And I spent some time thinking about what the surface is going to be like. And it has a number of layers on it. So it's first varnished, and then it has a layer of oil paint and varnish mixed together. And then it has a layer of, in the center part, it has a layer of bronze leaf. And then it has a layer of a mixture of varnish and graphite. And then when that sets up a little bit, I go back and work through that surface some to enhance the texture. So it's even the surface of it, to get the appearance that it has here, is a fair number of steps to work through. And deciding on, at one point, the whole thing was startling orange. And, you know, at that point, if you had seen it and looked at it, you would have gone, whoa, what is she thinking? But it's a question of layering and working back through the layers in order to get the effect.
Will the sculpture that you're working on now, will it have a similar finish treatment, or are you doing something different? Or don't you know yet? I
don't know yet, but probably it'll have a somewhat similar finish, something that enhances the textures, the gouge marks. I like them. They're like, to me, they're like drawing marks. So, you know, if I were doing a drawing, I would want the marks that I make to show. So when it's just a piece of wood and the gouge marks, it really looks surprisingly flat. The marks really need to be enhanced in order to be, at least to my eye, to be interesting.
Well, would you say that the color and the texture is very different from the thing, the seed that it's inspired by?
Yeah, it is. The little seed, the center portion is brown, and the outer edges are sort of parchment color. So yeah, it is pretty different from the original little seed.
Why do you take it away from what it was originally?
Well, that's a good question. I think because at a certain point, I'm not as interested in the reality of it or the exact representation, and more interested in what the form feels like it needs.
So it's more intuitive.
Yeah. Yes, Judy.
Kind of going with the coloration, your collages, which I really like. I like all of the show. Is that wax, or what have you used to have that sort of old feeling and makes it something other than just glue on paper?
Yeah, it is. Well, it was really interesting when Lori and I put the show together. I realized that the predominant color is brown. It really is, which is kind of strange to me. I didn't expect that somehow, even though I knew what I was bringing. Actually, what I started with was a piece of paper that had a tan color, but then, excuse me, on top of that, or maybe more like an ivory color. On top of that, I glued down old tea bags. So I took tea bags apart and took the paper from the stained paper from the tea bags, and then using matte medium, glued that down to the paper first as a base. So underneath them are various kinds of tea stained papers. It's kind of not really unlike making little marks in wood, you know, and it's like, it's a kind of obsessive behavior, tearing tea bags apart. And
very effective. I mean, it gives it a sort of an aged look. And again, more interesting than a collage might be if it were just put, you know, strictly on the paper. I couldn't tell. I actually thought it was maybe wax put on there.
It kind of has that appearance. I was surprised by that. I was also experimenting with different mediums. So I had gotten a variety of mediums from golden mediums, golden paint mediums. And so I was making up mixtures of matte mediums and gloss mediums in order to get something that wasn't completely flat, but also wasn't really glossy. So it does have that sort of waxy appearance. And then I started sticking everything down with the same thing, and also in some cases covering over it with the same thing. Basically in order to get a kind of unified surface.
Right. Online, we have a comment from Therese, Lori, and Lillian. They asked what type of wood was the elm made from, the elm seed, and what did you use to create the patina? And I think you kind of answered that. And then Lillian, age 3, likes your art and your ponytail.
Oh. Thank you, Lillian. That was very nice of you.
Jenny, I wanted to ask, I'm sorry.
I'm going to answer that question first. I was actually carving basswood. Basswood is a really nice wood to carve because it doesn't really have a strong grain, and it's not really hard, but it's also not really soft, but it's very even. So once you start carving, it doesn't have a lot of hard spots or soft spots, and so it carves very nicely. Yes, Carolyn.
I wanted to talk about the bottom shelf a little bit. If you've already talked about it, then I'll shut up.
I did say some things about it, but
well, a young boy, maybe 10, was here and was really drawn to that shelf. And so my question is, and I think this is, I probably know the answer, but when you laid those things out, what was the thought process behind how you laid them out? He could identify almost every single thing on that show. So.
That doesn't surprise me. Some of them are very common and some of them not as common. Basically, I was thinking about the way that things are in natural history museums laid out in patterns, or the way they're laid out for identification. So I was thinking some about that, but I was also using everything I know about composition for composing on a shape like that. But I really am pretty interested in museums and the way they lay things out.
We have another question online from Nettie.
Okay.
She says the processes for making these different pieces, talking about the collages, must be quite different. And also the other items. Do you enjoy working with certain materials more than others, and why?
Oh boy. Well, like I was saying, I can't carve for long stretches of time. So has to be a certain amount of downtime. And during that downtime, I do like working on things like the collages because they're faster. And you can also sit. They're not as strenuous. And I often would have 3 or more of them going at the same time. This is a sampling of a series that I did. So there are more. Actually, there are some on the university campus, I think in the humanities building from this same series. And so working with the smaller pieces is sort of like a little respite from doing more strenuous things. Is that okay? Does anybody else have any? Yes, Sandy.
And for the larger pieces, how do you decide what the scope and scale is going to be? When you start with something so small, how did you know that was the size it should be?
Well, usually when I'm thinking about doing a carving, I spend a certain amount of time with the idea sort of percolating. And I think about what feels like it would be a good size for that thing. How do I know what it feels like? Well, I think it has partly to do with just how it percolates in my imagination and my sort of my mind's eye, what I'm thinking about. And then I often make a cardboard pattern. So I'll sometimes take the thing and put it on my scanner and scan it with graph paper behind it. And then I'll take that and take a big piece of cardboard and lay a graph out on that, and then transfer the outline of what I'm thinking about onto that grid and cut it out, and then look at it for a while and think about, does that size feel like it's going to be comfortable? And there are transitions all the way along in that happen. I mean, you start from the original thing and then you have a generation. Maybe I draw it or maybe I scan it. And then there's another transition that happens between that or another generation and maybe making a cardboard pattern. And once I have a pattern that I feel comfortable with, then I start looking at my wood pile. And if I don't have the right wood, then I drive to Dilworth, Minnesota and buy wood, which is what I did for my recent piece that I'm working on. And then I lay that cardboard pattern on the wood and I mark it out and, start gluing up and so on and so forth. And you get a sense once it's actually in that, once you have that block of wood, that sort of chunk laid out, you get a feel for whether it's going to have the right size or the right sort of heft to it. And then, and then you just start working it. And for a long time, it looks really bad. For a long time, I mean, you're in for the long haul with it because there's a long growing up period when it just really, you're thinking, maybe I should just put this in the wood stove. Because it just doesn't look very interesting. And then eventually it all kind of comes together and you get near the end and you can kind of see that it's actually doing what you saw in your mind's eye. And you start feeling a lot better about it.
So is your piece of wood when you're starting, is it like square or, I mean, are you
Sometimes what I can do is I can cut off bits on my bandsaw before I start carving. So I do some chopping off of bits on the bandsaw first, and then, but it's pretty minimal because the reason that I don't, and I have tried using, I got a little chainsaw that fits on, chainsaw blade that fits onto a 4-inch grinder. And I tried doing like roughing out with that one time. And that was like not a good idea. I mean, it goes too fast. And the first thing you know, you've taken out material that you didn't mean to take out. And it just turns out to be better for me to go through the sort of tedious job of removing all that wood that you don't want. So yeah, that does pretty much start out, with the exception of sort of doing some very rough stuff with the bandsaw. It does start out like this, just this big chunk of wood.
How thick is it, Jenny? How thick is the wood? I mean, what's the?
Well, the center part probably started like that, and the outer parts started like that. Yeah, because I wanted to get a sense of sort of the waviness of the edges of that.
So you work on both sides?
Oh yeah, yeah. The other side looks as good as this side.
Oh, does it?
Oh yeah.
Well, so how do you display it? Do you aim it or?
No, it just lays there. Someone did suggest that I should think about a different way of displaying it. But I haven't thought of a way that I could display it that would allow you to see both sides and wouldn't interfere with the form.
Right.
I just haven't figured out a better way of doing it.
In case it can blast.
Any other questions?
Are you done? You mentioned your work on the bearded iris, right? And then you have the slippery elm seed. What other?
There's a box elder seed that's in the green dorm on the campus. Mm-hmm. There are some smaller pieces that I've made. I had a nice bud that destroyed itself. Wasn't very well engineered, and we actually tried hanging it on the wall in here, and it fell.
Oh no!
Which was sad. I don't know. I'm thinking about whether I can repair it again and do something with it. We'll see. Oh, I made a giant ash seed, which I don't own anymore, and a sort of hybridized begonia bud. The ash seed was about, well, it was taller than I am. Trying to think how tall it was. It's still in existence. It's pretty tall. Might be like 6 feet. It belongs to somebody who lives in Rochester, Minnesota, I think. And they also bought my begonia seed, which was a good sized begonia seed. Oh, and I have another carved piece that's just in my studio, which is part of a flower, which is pretty good size. I forgot about that piece. And actually, a number of the pieces don't have the same kind of surface that this piece has. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much for coming and listening.